doing this for, say about 50 years, being an activist. And he's also one of the founding members of, we hate to use the word militant, but it kind of ended up that way there. Sorry. I'll just hold it up. I gotta sit back.
Yeah, why don't you just hold it?
I'll just hold it. I'll just hold it. I'll just hold it. It's fine. Thank you. There's a group called AIM, and they're American Indian movement. Some people like what they do, others don't. And my uncle can express, you know, it may not have been the right way to do a lot of things. And so what we've done is we've basically gone back to our ways, the ways of the Creator, the laws that were given to us. And this presentation I'm going to show you, there's a lot of information that we have, and I'll explain it when we go through, but it's there's a hand of God is at work helping us with what we're doing here. So I might disappear for a little while, but I'm still here. In 2007, we had pipelines that were coming through this part of the territory here. This is in Canada, and we have what we call treaty people in Canada. There's a number of treaties, 1 to 11, who basically gave away all of the prairie provinces. And so when these pipelines were going through, there's a lot of concern about these pipelines, and a lot of them, there's a few of them that have blown up in our area. Different pipelines, gas pipelines, and the oil pipelines that have leaked into the groundwater. So these treaty Indians have tried to take Canada to court, and they lose every battle, every court case they lose. And so the younger generation started asking questions. Well, what's in these treaties? Why aren't these treaties helping us? You know, they're supposed to be, you know, a treaty is supposed to be based on peace, friendship, and equality, right? Well, unfortunately, the treaties that they signed with Canada were written in a foreign language, and they didn't know what they were signing. They agreed to share the resources, and what they found out was that what they signed was more or less a surrender agreement. So that's why they lose a lot of their cases. So what the pipelines didn't want was the Dakota people to take them to court. The reason being is that Dakota people don't have a treaty with Canada. You know, we've never signed any surrender agreements on this side of the border either with the United States. The 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty was actually a treaty where the United States sued for peace. And it's the only time that the United States government has ever surrendered. So that's a bit of our, you know, a little bit of history that's happening right now. So the pipelines told our leaders, our Dakota leaders, and we're broken up into nine reserves that have never signed treaty with Canada. There are other Lakota and Nakota reserves that have signed adhesions to treaties over the years, but the Dakota people have never signed any treaties with Canada. So what they did was they said, we're going to go on your behalf. Some of our oil executives are, you know, friends with some of the ministers and the Prime Minister, and we'll come to an agreement with you. And so in that agreement, it says that I'll see if I can. I forgot to put it up here earlier. That's why I'm in that agreement, it says, that the Dakota people don't have any rights, title, and privilege. But in saying so, here it is here. So, okay, so it says here that Canada's position that the Dakota First Nations do not have Aboriginal rights in Canada, nor do the historical facts give rise to a treaty adhesion claim. Therefore, the only remedy I can recommend to the minister to address the objectives listed Dakota proposal dated October 17th, 2007 is to make a financial offer to assist the First Nations. So what these grievances were are the way the Canadian system is, and it's very similar to the U.S. system, is that they provide funding to the reserves, to the reservations, and then we have in Canada it's called an Indian Act, and under that Indian Act we have elections and we elect the chief, and you know that the chief is more or less a chief administrative officer as opposed to hereditary or a traditional chief, like you know, the most famous one is Sitting Bull, right? So this is what they offered, and this was initially, it was supposed to have been just a straight economic development officer. We wanted some money so that we could start economic development. Dakota people do not like being dependent on anybody, and we've never been dependent on the government, but we were forced into it over the years, and I'll get into that a little later. So they offered us $60.3 million for 9 Dakota First Nations, and what they said was that you would take this offer and divide it between the 9. You take 9 divided by 60.3, you get 6.7 million for each community. Now, some of these communities, they have up to 2,500 people. Some have an on-reserve population of 15. So you would make millionaires out of some families there. Other reserves, 6.7 million, they would go through that in a matter of 4 months. So it wasn't fair to begin with. And then in addition to that, they were offering to, this money would buy land, fee simple land, and then they were willing to convert this to reserve status. Now reserve status is, it gives you a tax break for the people that are employed there, and you can get some goods and services that are tax exempt. But when you consider that the reserve population on any reserve anywhere is, you're lucky if you have 80% unemployment. You know, so 2 out of every 10 people, adult people, are working. So this tax exemption doesn't apply to the whole community. It only applies to the select few that are employed or would make use of a tax service like that. So the Dakota people, we don't believe in that. The other thing about a reserve, and this is the main reason why we don't like the system, that in order to accept this agreement, in order for us to get any kind of financial settlement with Canada will require comprehensive releases from each Dakota First Nation entering into a settled agreement releasing Canada from any future claims by the First Nations for Aboriginal treaty rights identified in Section 35 of the Constitution Act. So initially, they're saying that Canada's position as Dakota First do not have Aboriginal rights. We don't have any rights at all. But here's some money. But if you want this money, you're going to have to surrender your rights, title, and privilege that you never had in the first place, right? So this was unanimously rejected. So then the Dakota communities decided they were going to take Canada to court. And this was filed July 22nd of 2009, a year and a half later. Now, nine of the Dakota communities rejected that initial offer unanimously, right across the board. I was there at that meeting. I'll use the word chief, but the chief that I work with now, he runs his community, his Dakota people, the way it's been run from his dad. His dad passed on his leadership to him, and his grandfather before him, and his dad before him, and his dad before him, and his dad before him for the last 1,000 years. We still run that same form of government that the Dakota people had from day one. Now, I heard a gentleman here talking about the Six Nations Confederacy, it's one of the oldest democracies. Well, we have that. Now, with our community, this, and again, I'm using the word chief or leader. He was forgotten about all these years. Canada forgot about him, and I'll get to that later. So this form of government that he has is not under the Indian Act. He's not an elected leader. In Canada, we have elections every 2 years. You know, in 2 years, somebody like myself would become the chief, right? And in those 2 years, I'm supposed to learn everything about the workings of the government, right? And then by the time I actually learn anything, there's an election, and I'm done. A new guy comes in, same thing, 2 years, every 2 years we go through this. So Canada's got a good system set up here. So in a year and a half since that 2007, this July of you can see up there, it says the governments and councils of Sioux Valley Dakota Nation, Chinook Dakota Nation, and Dakota Plains. Dakota Plains is where I'm working with. I used to live in Sioux Valley. Sioux Valley is the biggest one, Dakota Plains is the smallest. 6.7 million for Dakota Plains, that chief, his family, they'd all be millionaires. And he was the first one that rejected it because it wasn't fair to everybody. And that, in essence, is what the Dakota people are about. So, there was only three of the communities left. And so, we took Canada to court July 22nd. We received this November 30th of that same year. Now, in court, you're allowed 30 days to respond, right? So they asked for an extension for 45 days, which should have took them into September. We didn't get this till the end of December. Now Canada, right from day one, has stated that Dakota people are refugees in Canada. I'm a refugee. My uncle is a refugee. And that is. So Canada's statement of defense, and I won't go through it point by point, but they made a concession. They acknowledged that we had a treaty with the British, but they used it in the past tense, had. They say that this treaty expired after the War of 1812 because our treaty with the British was a military, trade, and economic alliance, and it was also based on equality. What we had, they had. What they had, we had. We used the English alphabet, and we used to communicate with each other. We used to write in Dakota, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But so they say we had a treaty, but it was only specifically for military political purposes before the cessation of hostilities between the United States and the United Kingdom. So after 1814, there was no more treaty. And then they go on to say that the Royal Proclamation of 1763 did not bind the British Crown or the Crown right in Canada to enter any treaty with the plaintiffs. So this Royal Proclamation of 1763 was an outline of how they were supposed to proceed and how they were supposed to deal with the native tribes in making treaties and operating with them. So that didn't apply to us, Canada says. And then it goes further on, and it says that the plaintiffs, us, were habitually resident in the United States of America and the territory of Minnesota, later the Dakota Territory until 1862, 1865. And we migrated into across the 49th parallel. And it also says that they deny any allegations in paragraph, denies treaty, fiduciary trusts, that contractual moral duty owed by the government of Canada, and it goes on to say that denies any existence of any Aboriginal title rights, entitlement, legal interests. it says, denies any negligent or intentional misrepresentation, deception, or breach of trust, or any wrongdoing, says the government of Canada was under no obligation or duty to negotiate or treat or consult with the plaintiff's ancestors. So they never did anything illegal or anything wrong in dealing with the Native people and including the Dakotas. He further states, he being the Attorney General of Canada, have so long delayed taking legal action under alleged claims that it's no longer possible or reasonably practicable to procure evidence to answer or defend against them. We had the knowledge of the matters complained of in the statement of claim for many years, failed to act, and that the plaintiffs are therefore barred from proceeding with this action. And there's some big words there that I don't even want to talk about. So this was given to the judge. The judge denied this part of it, and they said, we're going to court. So the Dakotas have been in the court now since July 22nd or July 24th of 2009. Now the following year, we had our first meeting with Canada. And Canada wanted us to put our court case in abeyance, which means you don't kill the court case, but you just put it aside while you try to negotiate. And this is what people have been saying to us all along. Well, why haven't you negotiated with the government? Well, we try and negotiate with the government, but the government comes back with those documents like that, and we have those letters here. Now there are some documents that I don't have available up there, but there's two letters here. One is from Tom Sidden, June 25th, 1992. And I'm going to read this. I'll read this paragraph to you. Following the Minnesota Sioux War of 1862 and the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, both Santee and Teton Sioux crossed the Great Medicine Line, the 49th parallel, the international border, and sought sanctuary in Canada. It is clear from the historical record that this relocation was to escape the retribution of the United States government. The Dakota arriving in Canada did not claim Aboriginal title. Instead, they put great emphasis on a right to be treated fairly as refugees, on the basis of their service to the British Crown during the Revolutionary War in the War of 1812. In support of this, the Dakota displayed medals and gorgets of King George III, which their ancestors had received from a grateful sovereign. Now, this letter is dated June 25th, 1992, and it's from the Minister of Indian Affairs, Tom Sidden. Well, I have a letter here dated January 24th, 1996, and I'll just read a portion of this paragraph. Following the Minnesota Sioux War of 1862 and the Battle of the Little Bighorn, both the Santee and Teton Sioux crossed the Great Medicine Line, so it's the same paragraph, right? This one is dated January 24th, 1996, and it's from the Minister of Indian Affairs, Ron Irwin. So this is the kind of treatment that we get from the Canadian government. You know, what happened here was the Minister of Indian Affairs comes in, he gets elected to a cabinet position. He becomes the Minister of Indian Affairs, and then he goes back to his office, and there's a question there, what do we do with the Dakotas? So what does he do? Does he go and do his own research to find out what this problem is with the Dakotas? No, he goes to his staff. His staff go to the filing cabinet, fill out the last letter they written on behalf to the Dakota people. They take the letter, make a few changes, change the date and the name, he signs it, and he sends it out. And this is what we deal with the Canadian government. So when we were going to take Canada to court, our elders told us that before we can proceed, we need to know what our history is. We need to know what kind of evidence we can put together. Now, I have here a book. This is from 2007. It says the establishment of the Dakota reserves in Manitoba. This is what Canada calls research. It's all Indian Affairs letters, Indian agents that wrote letters back and forth to Canada, and basically it says that these Dakota people, whichever letter it is, they came across from the United States. So this is what Canada calls research. I'm going to show you and Canada does that because they control everything, every aspect of our life with this Indian Act. They control every aspect of it. So when we want research done, and my uncle has been doing this, I said, for 50 years. You know, this is what they ran into with the Canadian government all the time. We want research, we want to hire our own research. Oh no, you don't have to do that. We've got researchers, we'll do our research for you. That's the information we get. So we hired a fellow by the name of James Ritchie. He's from Scottish descent. And I never knew a lot about the Scottish history until I started talking to James. And there's a fellow by the name of William Wallace. They made a movie about him called Braveheart. Now this guy was trying to get solidarity for sovereignty for his people. And they quartered him. And he hung his body parts on the different the borders of the English as a warning to anybody that if they ever tried that again. So when we talk about tragedies and things like that, this has been going on for years. But it's always somebody dominating over somebody else. And so our elders hired this gentleman to help us, and he has an affinity with the Dakota people, which I won't get into, but he has an obligation that he acquired from another Scottish fellow. And in their way of life, when somebody takes an oath to do something, they have to carry it out, or they get somebody to carry it out for them. So James was this fellow, and he was a newspaper reporter. So he's investigative by nature. So when Canada hires a researcher, the researcher does what Canada tells them to. When we hire a researcher, we hired a fellow that would question what the elder would say. He's not going to believe him just because the elder says okay and he writes it down. He goes into the archives and he tries to find evidence, right? So the elders told him that the Dakota influence extended from the Northwest Territories, which is up here, all the way down to South Carolina down here, down into the Mississippi. And in our language, there's certain words that people have used to name their towns. One of them is Winona. When Winona, properly translated, it's the firstborn daughter. And there's a town here in Santee, in South Carolina, named Santee. Now Santee, of course, is a Dakota word. It means like a knife, right? So I did some little bit of research about this town, and that's what it is. It's from a Dakota word. So when our elders said that our territory extended from here to here, this is where we're from here, in this area here. So we have a good relationship with the Dene people further north, and the Cree and the Soto people now. They also say that they have records from their elders that the Dakotas were way up into this part of the territory. And contrary to popular belief, we weren't at war with everybody. Prior to the Europeans coming, we were pretty much lived in harmony. We never had any homeless people, no hungry people. Everybody looked after everybody. And so that was the extent of the territory. And then next, when the British and the French came into this part of the territory here, if you go back to the previous one, we were in and around the Great Lakes area. So the British made a treaty with the Dakotas, and it started with the Hudson's Bay Charter in 1670. The Hudson's Bay Charter is basically all the waters that flowed into Hudson's Bay, Hudson's Bay. So in this part of the territory here, they'd be dealing with the Crees and the Ojibways and the Iroquois and all the other tribes. Over here, they'd be dealing with the Dene people, and then the Cree further north, and then down here, this is all Dakota territory. So they had to make an agreement with the Dakotas in order to have access to all this territory here. So that started in 1670. In 1753, there was what they call a 7 Years' War. I don't know if you're familiar with the province of Quebec, but Quebec used to be a French territory. And now it's a province within Canada, and they still to this day, they do not get along with the English. There are some people that wanna break away from Canada and the French to become a sovereign state. So after that 7-year war was over, our treaty was with the British. And again, it's a military, economic, and trade alliance. Prior to this war, the French controlled the St. Lawrence Seaway. So the only way the British could get back from in this area here was through here, so they had to pay taxes to the French. When they made a treaty with us, it was for economic and trade, and we gave them an alternate route down the Mississippi and then back out this way. So after the 7-year war, the British controlled this part of the territory, and they didn't have to use this alternative route. So the next battle that took place was the Revolutionary War. The United States breaks away and it creates its own country. Now the British again call in the Dakotas, and because we have a military trade economic alliance, we go and we fight with the British. Now, this is a letter from March 27th, 1780. It says, General Wabasha was well contented with his commission, and believe me, his warriors are nothing inferior to regular troops. And I know it says that because it's been transcribed into here. So here's General Wabasha was well contented with his commission, believe me, his warriors are nothing inferior to regular troops in regard to discipline their own way. So even though Wabasha was a Dakota, and this word here is not, it's not Wabasha, it's supposed to be Wahbesha, but you know, it's difficult for a foreigner to repeat this name, so they changed his name to Wabasha. And first and principal, cared to examine their arms in the morning, drawing their powder, always fresh loaded at sunset. So this is an indication of the treaty that we had. Now, the legal person that we had working with us at this time told us that if you can't find a copy of the treaty, find evidence of treaty behavior, right? So this is evidence of treaty behavior. Now, this year being the 2012, it's also an anniversary for Canada. So what Canada did was they wanted to have a commemoration for all the Indians. And I'll talk about that word Indian later. Now what Canada wanted to do was they wanted to have a commemoration for all the Indians that helped the British during the War of 1812. Now, it is true that the British hired mercenaries. They hired different tribes to fight alongside with them. But what happened in a lot of cases was these tribes, because they're only fighting for money, when the fighting got too intense or it didn't look too good, they would bail out. And this is an example of one of them. So there's an escort with some prisoners and some people, and they were attacked and they were killed. So it says here, a like disaster cannot happen next year. I can venture to assure your excellency that the 1,000 Sioux, again that's a brigadier general, 1,000 Sioux, 1,000 warriors under it, without any mixture from neighboring tribes, will be in the field in April under Wabasha if no accident happens to him. His interpreter, Monsieur Rogue, is a thorough, honest man. Both have conceived the necessity for profound secrecy, as well as the design and manner of executing it. In order to avoid the excited reports, curiosity and suspicion they always excite in traversing such an extent of country. everything was settled with Wabasha here and his wants for supply. So there's evidence of our treaty. So the western boundary of the United States at that time is the Ohio River Valley. Of course, these are the 13 colonies, so you can see there's still pockets of Dakota-speaking people in and around here. You can see that the territory shrunk further north. Now, it wasn't the wars that killed off our people, it was disease. We had never had any of these diseases that were upon us now. We had measles and smallpox and whooping cough and all kinds of stuff. And there's documented evidence, again, with the Jesuit priests in Canada and Army documents down here that they purposely infected blankets to decimate our population. So the next slide here, again, now this is in 1812. And the Mississippi River Valley is now the western border of the United States at that time. And so again, because we have a treaty with the British, we were asked to help and fight against the United States. So there's three documented battles here: Battle of Detroit, Battle of Prairie du Chien further down here, and Battle of Michilimackinac, which is in and around here. So at these battles, the Dakota showed up with, again with the thousand warriors, and they won the battles. And something I wanna make something clear. When we're talking about this, I've done these presentations at universities and at public schools and for people in general, right? We don't want anybody to feel that we're holding you responsible for anything. There's a word in our language, and that word is washichu. Now, a washichu is a greedy person. Our language is descriptive, so we describe, if we meet somebody, we describe a character about them. So unfortunately, all the greedy people that our people met back then were white. So eventually, over the years, a washichu person became to mean a white person, but that's not what that word means. It's a greedy person. And trust me, we have greedy people in our world. There's greedy people all over this world. And that's a lot of the reason why we're in the position that we are. So, this is the Dakota Territory now. This is at the War of 1812. And I want to show you a couple of letters. These are love letters from my ex-girlfriend. No. So this is Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson was not the president at the time of the War of 1812, but I wanted to find out because Thomas Jefferson is one of the founding fathers, right? So I wanted to know what his thoughts were about the Native people. Okay, so the War of 1812, he's conferring with his friend and Baron Alexander von Humboldt. This is in the presidential library. You can find it. Okay. So he says, "You know, my friend, the benevolent plan we were pursuing here for the happiness of the Aboriginal inhabitants in our vicinities. We spared nothing to keep them at peace with one another, to teach them agriculture and the rudiments of the most necessary arts, to encourage industry by establishing among them separate property." Now, we don't believe in fences and things of that nature. Everybody is equal, and we looked after each other, and we never had personal property, separate property. In this way, they would have been enabled to subsist and multiply on a moderate scale of landed possession. They would have mixed their blood with ours and been amalgamated and identified with us within no distant period of time. That's assimilation. On the commencement of our present war, this is the War of 1812, we pressed on them the observance of peace and neutrality, okay? Because we fought with the British during the Revolutionary War, so they didn't want us fighting and helping the British. We pressed on them the observance of peace and neutrality, but the interested and unprincipled policy of England has defeated all our labors for the salvation of these unfortunate people. So up here we're okay, we're good Indians. Down here now we're unfortunate people. They have seduced the greater part of the tribes within our neighborhood to take up the action against us, and the cruel massacres they have committed on the women and children of our frontiers taken by surprise will oblige us now to pursue them to extermination or to drive them to new seats beyond our reach. Okay, so this is Thomas Jefferson. He has another letter. He has another letter here concerning the Indians. Now this is in response to a previous letter, where our post proceeding, that which brought your letter of May 21st, so I won't get into all of it, but there's two fellows that lived with the native people. And, one was Lafitau, he's a Frenchman, and the other one was Adair. Now he says Adair had his king. He believed all of the Indians of America to be descended from the Jews. Same laws, usages, rites, ceremonies, same sacrifices, priests, prophets, fast festivals, almost the same religion. They all spoke Hebrew. Now, when you heard my uncle talk, right, he has a lot of in his, and if you listen to somebody from Hebrew, that's the way they talk. Now, it is true that we have the same laws, the same usages, because what's written in the Old Testament is what our laws are. Okay, so that wasn't far-fetched. Now, so he called it a kink, right? And the French explorer, he also, so he says, you ask further if the Indians have any order of priesthood among them, like the Druids, bards, minstrels, right? So this is what Thomas Jefferson, they are persons pretending to have communications with the devil and other evil spirits who foretell future events, bring down rain, find stolen goods, raise the dead, destroy some, heal others by enchantment, lay spells, etc. So there's people that were living amongst our people and had a different, we were people. But the president, along with the government, branded us as devil worshippers, and there's a reason for that. We were demonized for a reason. I'll get to that later. So next we get to 1862. 1862 is when the Minnesota Uprising happened. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the Minnesota Uprising, but there was what the United States used to do, or what they would do is they would take a piece of property, hundreds of square miles, and they would make a treaty with the Indians in that area. But they would tell the Indians that, look, you live in this area here, it's 5 miles by 10 miles or whatever. You live here, you don't have to hunt, you don't have to fish, you don't have to do anything. We'll look after you. We'll provide you with everything that you need. And for a year and a half, the government would actually do that. They would keep their word and they would do that. But in the meantime, they would settle around them for hundreds of miles. Once everybody was settled, then the government would cut back on the supplies. And then again, this word was Shichu, right? The wagon train, I'm just using that as an example, right? The wagon train leaves Washington. On the way there, it goes through different traders, right? So each trader would take something off that wagon till it actually got to the people it was supposed to serve. By that time, there's very little left. So now, there's men in this audience here. If your family is hungry, what are you going to do? You're a hunter. You go back to your original hunting ground. It might be 20 miles away, 30 miles, or 5 miles away. But now you're crossing some of these property. There's fences up, there's, you know, somebody's got a crop in, you know, all of this. So eventually somebody's gonna get shot. Usually it's the non-native person. The government comes and says, look, Indians, you left the reserve, you violated this treaty, you bring the army and wipe everybody out. So this is also what happened in 1862 in Minnesota. Now the Dakota people had we had a reserve, everything was done. The Civil War was on, and so there was a treaty payment that was supposed to come out, and we're starving. And these are our relatives, right? Our great grandparents. 1862 isn't that long ago. So there's a warehouse there, and there's a fellow by the name of Myrick. He's the trader. He's got a storehouse full of food, like a hockey rink size full of food. And he would not give advances to the Dakotas. And he made a comment that let them eat grass. Now this got out, and people were upset, and just like what I had said before, people started going out, the Dakota people were going off to hunt. And of course something happened, somebody got killed. They came back and they told the leadership at the time, this fellow named Little Crow. He knew, because he'd been out east to Washington, he knew the numbers, he knew the power of the United States. But the warriors there, they would rather fight than, you know, starve. And so they started a war. And this war lasted for a little under 2 months. The conclusion of the war, we lost 300 of our warriors were sentenced to hang. There's a movie out called Lincoln right now. Lincoln, of course, is famous for the Emancipation Proclamation, where all men are created equal. They freed the slaves. The African Americans were made people. So all men are created equal except Indians. And so at the conclusion of this war, they because there was 300 people that were set to be hanged, they reviewed them and they cut it down to 38. So 38 people were executed. Now I'm going to show you. I'm just going to play you a clip. This is called the Dakota 38, and it's just a clip, but just you'll get a little bit of the story here. Now it's 38. The 38 were hung on Boxing, well, in Canada we call it Boxing Day, but it's December 22nd.
For the memory of the 38 Dakota, not only do we have a horse, a ride, we also have a run. Not only are we remembering, we're honoring our ancestors and those that have passed and struggled before us.
It means a lot to me. We're kind of tracing through the footsteps of the 38 Dakota plus 2 that had to go through this. So we're kind of, I don't know how to explain it, but we're kind of going back through that experience again.
I've always believed in, you know, that they're watching over us, you know, like, you know, it's not just us up there running. So that's just kind of the way I see it.
We know our history and it hurts, but we're no longer in that prison no more. Reconciliation means something to everybody, and I think it's a collective.
And we actually also had the opportunity to catch the run. We ran for 2 miles at about 3 a.m., so it's been quite an adventure for the 5 of us who were there last night. So thank you to the riders, thank you to the runners.
These fellows running are the producers of the film, this film that we're watching here.
On that fateful day, they were led out of the prison compound. They were shackled and chained together and had hoods on. The women began wailing and weeping. One of the prisoners in a loud voice said, "Namach umpo witakwepi, hear me, my people. To today is not a day of defeat. It is a day of victory. For we have made our peace with our Creator. We now go to be with Him forever. Remember this day to tell our children so they can tell their children that we are people who died and over death. Do not mourn for us. Rejoice with us. It's a good day to die. And then he lifted up his voice and began singing.
I just want to tell all of you that I love you. We're doing this for our children, our grandchildren. And I want to thank all of you that helped me fulfill this dream. It's been a blessing for our people.
53 years ago, I entered first grade, and I was taught nothing but misinformation about the people that preceded me on this land. And it wasn't until the 1980s, when I walked into my first powwow at the Land of Memories, when I realized that I didn't know anything except lies, for the most part. And so I started that day to listen. Whereas the Dakota people lived in unity with the land for many years, long before the European people came, and whereas the Dakota people have suffered unimaginable hardship over a long period of time, as the land and riches they once had were gradually removed from their control. And whereas the Dakota people have many times been forcibly relocated at the whim of the United States government, and whereas one outcome of their trials was the largest mass execution ever recorded in U.S. history, during which 38 Dakota were hanged. And whereas the Dakota people have put forth tremendous effort in an attempt to continue to heal from their suffering over all these years. And whereas the people of this community welcome the Dakota people to be part of our community today and always, and whereas the people of this community recognize the responsibility we must bear in this healing process, and whereas the people of this community wish to be part of the healing process as the wounds begin to close. Now, therefore, in recognition of the tremendous contribution made by the Dakota people toward that healing process to our community and communities in the region, I, John D. Brady, Mayor of the City of Mankato, Minnesota, do hereby proclaim December 26, 2008 to be Dakota Reconciliation Okitsuye Day. And in the sense of true reconciliation, I just want to say, welcome back to your home.
Jim Miller, that fellow with the cowboy hat on, he was a veteran, a Vietnam War veteran. And he had a dream in 1995, and this dream kept recurring to him, that he was supposed to take this ride back east. And we repressed a lot of memories, especially on the state side. And he didn't know about this. You know, he didn't know about this mass execution that happened. It's still the largest mass execution in U.S. history. And so he organized, or he had some people help him, and they organized a ride. So they went from Crow Creek in South Dakota to Mankato, Minnesota. And that's what this ride was about. And what the reporters that were there when they escorted the prisoners out, because they were in prison, they were, you know, they wrote letters in Dakota that they found last February, not this past February, but the previous February before. And these were all written in Dakota, and they found them in a church there. There was a minister that used to go visit the Dakotas. So they write letters, and they were letters to the family and stuff. And he had stashed them in the church, and then they turned up last February, and they were talking about their living conditions. So they had no the stove that they had was taken away from them. They were given very little food, no blankets, that kind of stuff, and it was like a concentration camp. And through all that, when the warriors were unshackled and they were led, and that song that they told there, they were telling the ones that were crying for them not to cry. You know, we're going home. We're going to go home. We're going to be standing with the Creator. And that tells a lot about our Dakota people. And it's still, I've seen this video so many times, and yet it still gets me every time. But that's, you know, that's documented history. That's documented U.S. history. So in 1862, we had the Minnesota Uprising. Now you can see there's the broken blue line across here. This is the 49th parallel. After the War of 1812, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent is signed. The British and the U.S. divide the country in half, basically. And up until 1862, 63, there were still rumblings on the U.S. side about invading Canada, but nothing happened. No war took place. Instead, they had a war between themselves, which is where the Emancipation Proclamation comes from. There's a civil war. And so this is the U.S. territory. At that point in 1862, this is the U.S. territory. So they had control of most of the territory except for this area here on the Canadian side here. Now if you look over here, this dark red part, this is Canada in 1867. That was Canada. So they hadn't acquired any of this territory yet. British Columbia was called Oregon Territory, and both the U.S. and the Canadian, or the British, were governing this territory, but Canada had not acquired it to become part of Canada yet. So this is 1862. So now we get up to 1875, and this is when the Battle of the Little Bighorn takes place. If you're not familiar with the Battle of the Little Bighorn, I'll give you a quick. General Custer was a Civil War hero, and he was a good man in that he didn't tolerate a lot of insubordination, and so he kind of ratted out some of his fellow army people. And so when the war was over, they had to downscale the army, and they made General Custer lieutenant colonel, which was, in the army sense, a huge demotion. So he wanted to restore some of his his honor. And so when it came to fighting the Native people, he was always front and center. And so at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the 7th Cavalry was basically wiped out. And there's a documentary that goes along with this, and I thought I had it, but I don't. And but this documentary, what it does is it tells the story that the U.S. has been telling for the past 100 years, in that the only way we won was because there was more Indians than the army had bullets. Hordes of Indians kept coming over the hill, whooping and hollering, and they would fight, fire, and eventually they ran out of bullets, and that's how we won that battle. Well, in 1984, there was a fire that went through the Little Bighorn Valley. And you know how grass grows over top of each other over the years, it turns into a carpet? Well, that's the way this valley was up until that point, till this grass fire went through. And they said it looked like the moonscape. So people were finding shell casings and bullet and fragments and belt buckles and all kinds of things. And they even found the skeletal remains of still inside a boot. So they taped it off like a crime scene. I don't know if anybody ever watches CSI, the forensic investigation. Well, they taped it all off. They went over it with metal detectors, and they cataloged everything. And then they sent it to the crime labs. And a bullet, each firing pin has its own marking under a microscope, just like a fingerprint. Under a microscope, it has little, just like a key. So no two bullets are the same. So you track these bullets, and you can track a warrior, you can track a soldier. So there was an actual battle that took place. The U.S. Army fights in a certain manner. Every 12 or 15 yards, there's a soldier. And they go in a straight line along a hill or along. And then they wait for the commanding officer to drop his arm, and they fire. And then they reload and they fire again. And when they timed this interval, because the rifles that they were using, they were called a Springfield top loading, right? So you pop the top, put the bullet in, close it, cock it, wait for them, fire. Same thing, unload, reload. And so if you find 12 shell casings in a little pile every 15 yards, well, you know that particular battle lasted for 12 minutes, in and around. So they found the skirmish line, and then down in the bottom in the grass, they found all different kinds of shells, bullets. So they cataloged all those, and they knew that those were from the Dakotas. And at that point, they were surprised that we had so many firearms, because nobody was allowed to trade with us, arms or ammunition. Because this battle had been going on since 1862. This is 1876 at the Little Bighorn. So they set up that first skirmish line. They broke that. They set up a second skirmish line, not quite as organized as the first one. That was broken. And then there was where they found Custer and his men on top of the hill. So according to the story, the U.S. story, there was a huge gun battle on that hill where they expended all their bullets, and they found a handful of shell casings there. There was no epic battle. Instead, they found a trail of bullets going down into a ravine, and on the top of this ravine there was up to 8 points of shell casings in little clumps, and that's where they believed that the last of the soldiers were killed inside that ravine. And the other thing that they found really surprising with these firearms were that over 200 of these warriors had what they called a Henry repeating rifle. The Winchester bought them out later on, but those are the lever action, the John Wayne gun rifle. And so this was a 15-shot repeating rifle, and this you could fire off. You could empty that gun in a matter of seconds. So the story that was told at that time was basically a lie, but it was done to protect the legacy of Custer. Now, this is what people don't know. 8 days prior to that, there was what they call the Battle of the Rosebud. Now, there was three army columns converging on the Dakotas in that Minnesota or the Montana area there. There's one coming from Fort Fetterman from the south, that's General Crook. There's one coming from Oregon, and then the 7th Cavalry from Bismarck. So they were all converging, and they were going to corner us and put us back in the reservation. And, you know, they say that there's anywhere between 7,000 and 8,000 people, or warriors, that were in that valley that day. But it wasn't warriors, it was women, children, kids, elders. And when we left the reserves at that time, the leaders could see what was happening to the people. You know, we weren't allowed to hunt anymore. We were confined to a place. They were bringing us food. They were hand feeding us. And so our way of life was falling apart. They didn't like it, so they said voluntarily they left. So whoever left with them volunteered to go. We didn't force anybody to go. There was a lot of people that left that stayed behind. So when we were in that valley, it wasn't 7,000 warriors, there was maybe 700 warriors there. And so 8 days prior to the Little Bighorn battle, this battle took place. Now this one was with 1,000. You know, again, a general has 1,000 men under his command, right? So this happened, and this was a few miles from the Little Bighorn Valley. But this column is what was stopped first. And there's I'm going to show you something, and I'll explain it later. A little bit of the significance behind it, but there's a chapter here, and it's called The Best Cavalry on Earth. Now there's a Captain Anson Mills who wrote this portion of it, but at the back of the book here, there's all kinds of the soldier accounts, their reports of what happened. And so basically General Crook got his butt kicked, he turned around and he went back to Fort Fetterman. So one half of this pincher movement had gone back south. And unbeknownst to the other two generals that were coming, their southern flank was now, wasn't there anymore. So nobody really knows about this battle. So here you see the southern border. There's an interstate that goes through the Black Hills. I think it's I-90. And that interstate used to be, it was the original trail. It was called the Thieves Road. Now I don't know if you guys know the story, but the Black Hills were full of gold. And so that was part of the Great Sioux Reservation, it was called. And it was supposed to have been left untouched, right? But as soon as they found gold in there, the president sent a letter, said, protect the miners at all costs. So they made a road going there, and it was called the Thieves Road. Well, that road is now I-90. On in Montana and Wyoming, there's an interstate that comes up from Billings, Montana, goes down through to Cheyenne. That's the Bozeman Trail. And then there's an interstate that goes west to Cheyenne, and that's called the Oregon Trail. So all these trails, they eventually were used for the road systems. Well, in Canada, we have what's called the Yellowhead Highway, and it's Highway 16, and it follows this northern boundary like this. I'm going to show you, now again, this is from 1875. I'm going to show you a map. This is what the British called the Aboriginal map of North America, denoting the boundaries and the locations of various Indian tribes in Manitoba. there's the map. The bottom left here, it says Indian Nations. Indian Nations wants to dwelling east of the Mississippi, and it has the Dakota or Sioux there. So remember that, the initial map that I told you, our people were all the way out to the east coast, so there's a map with the proof on it. I also told you about a town in South Carolina called Santee. Well, there's the River Santee. And then, just so the Canadian government can't say that this is a map that was done in error, or it says here, statement of the number of Indians, natives to the country west of the Mississippi, east of the Rocky Mountains, as here Sioux and Tetons, 27,500. And then this is for Canada's sake, east of the Rocky Mountains, Blackfoot and Sioux group consisting of 8 tribes, 30,000 people. So, if you take a look at this map, the Sioux or Dakota comes through here. There's a different, I don't know if you can make it out here, but here it says Assiniboine or Stone Indians. Now this is where Fort Garry is, which is where Lake Manitoba was. It says Assiniboine here. It says Assiniboine or Stone, and up here it says Cree Indians. Now Stone Indians and Assiniboines are also Dakota, but they just give them different names. When you read some of the early explorers, if they fired on you, they were Sioux. If they invited you in for tea, they were Assiniboine. So that's the difference that they made there. So these Stone Indians, who are those? Well, the anthropologists would record things, and they would provide a description. So because these Indians used stones in their ceremonies and in their cooking and everything else like that, they were referred to as the Stone Indians, which again are the Dakotas. Now, 1,000 years from now, if some calamity happens to hit, and an anthropology team comes around and they start excavating, and they find a bunch of screwdrivers, well, guess what? You guys will be called screwdrivers. So for the Canadian government to call us refugees, this map comes from some hearings. It's called the British Parliamentary Select Committee on the Hudson's Bay Company, 1857. Now, the Hudson's Bay Charter was going to expire in 1869. So, because the British government was the biggest landholder in the world at that time, they also had they had control of territories in India and Africa and South America, and they knew from experience that they wouldn't be able to keep those places. So what they did was they made a select committee. And in here, these are transcripts, verbatim transcripts, word for word transcripts of what was said at those select committee hearings. One of the fellows that was part of the select committee was John A. Macdonald. And I don't know if you know any Canadian history or not, but John A. Macdonald later became the first Prime Minister of Canada. So they had access to, they were part of these hearings. And at the back of during the select committee hearings, they had this map. And I showed you the Canada Statement of Defense, right? They had no prior knowledge that the Dakotas were ever resident north of the 49th, and which is where we get the term refugee from. So Canada's, their court case has been blown out of the water numerous times then. So when we took Canada to court, we had to submit our evidence January of last year, January 30th of last year. Canada will not accept our evidence. Instead, they're dragging this court process out. Because like I stated before, every 2 years we have elections in our communities, right? So a new chief comes in, he doesn't like what the previous chief was doing, and he bails out. And that's what happened in one of our communities. Now we only have 2 communities left that are part of this court process. Okay, so this is evidence that we've acquired. These are the actual handwritten verbatim transcripts of that time. And I showed you previously, and you guys can pass this around if you want, but these are letters of Indian agents, and this is Canada's version of research done on our behalf. So there's our research and there's Canada's research. Now I want to show you something here. It says on the bottom here, it says Public Archives of Canada. If you go to the National Archives in Canada in Ottawa, and it's just like a library. You go there, you order, you want something, you find something on, we used to use microfiche back in the day. So you wind this little viewer thing and you decide you want this copy of this, they'll give you this and they'll put a stamp on the bottom. Now the Public Archives of Canada, it was called that 25 years ago. Then it changed to the Library Arts of Canada, or Library Archives of Canada, and then now it's called the National Archives of Canada. So you remember when we got this? 2007, right, 5 years ago. These letters that are in here, it says Public Archives of Canada. Now, if you go to the National Archives in the order, it's going to say National Archives of Canada. So where did this researcher get these documents with Public Archives of Canada? Well, they were in a filing cabinet in the corner over here. All he did was he pulled out the filing cabinet, took all the documents, sent it to a printer, had it nicely bound, gave it to a law firm. Law firm says, you don't really have a case, but we'll take your case for you if you want to take Canada to court. Because they know that based on this, we're going to lose. That's why we have a hard time dealing with the government. So there's the map. There's the the Dakota Territory through here, up through here, down along through here. It's all Sioux and Assiniboine, right? And then if we go back to our other map, it runs along the same. Now, we did these maps independent of this other map. So for them to coincide like that is either coincidence or we may know what we're talking about. Okay, so I want to talk about present day. We have now a reserve in both Canada and United States. If you're going to take your family out for dinner, you're going to have a birthday party at a local pizza joint, or you order a reservation, right? So you go on that day, you go eat, and you leave. Is that table still yours? No, you only have the reservation for the time that you're using it. Well, the reserves that we have in Canada and the United States are the same principle. They're reserved for use by Indians. So in the Indian Act, it says that reserves are land set aside for use by Indians. It's held in trust by the federal government, so they own title to the land, right? A reserve is owned by the federal government, either in Canada or the United States. Okay, that offer that was given to us previous, right? They were going to give us $6.7 million each. We could buy land with it, and what did they want us to do with it? Convert it to reserve, right? Because some people would have tax exemption, right? So the treaty reserves or the treaty Indians in Canada, they have what they call a treaty land entitlement. Right? So back in the day, there was 1,000, if there was 1,000 people in that community or in that treaty base that was gonna sign a treaty, well, you then divide that by 5 and you get 200. So they would be eligible, each family of 5 was eligible for 160 acres. That was the Homestead Act. Basically take 200 people times 160 acres, that's a pretty big land base, right? So what the federal government is doing now in Canada is they're saying, well, we shorted you all this land back then. So in lieu of that, we're gonna settle with you a treaty land entitlement settlement. Some of these treaty bands have received anywhere from $80 million to $120 million, but they don't get it. It's put in trust for them, right? Because they're wards of the government, they can't handle their money, so they put it in trust. And they tell them that you can go out and you can buy land with this money, buy fee simple land. And when you do that, we'll convert it to reserve status for you, so that you're tax exempt. So these treaty Indians take this money, they go buy land, and then the government of Canada will convert it to reserve status for them. So what have they just done? They've given that land back to the Canadian government again. So again, they don't own anything. Only thing that they have is this tax exemption, which really doesn't mean anything. We tried to explain that to the treaty Indians, but they won't listen to us. And so we use this as an example. In 1942, while the Second World War was on, right? And the Department of National Defense wanted Stony Point Reserve. This is Lake Huron. This is Stony Point Reserve. And this is the Kettle Reserve. They wanted the Stony Point Reserve for a military training camp. They began investigating the site February 1942. In April, the Indian agent is he administers the funds, he does everything for the reserve, right? The Indian agent tried to get a volunteer surrender, the Kettle and Stony Point band refused. What the Canadian government wanted was for these Indians to move over to this reserve while they used this for a military training point. After the war is over, the Stony Point Indians could move back here again, and they refused. So what does the government do? The Department of National Defense acquired the reserve under the War Measures Act. That's like martial law. The appropriation was authorized. Border Council military camp was called Camp Ipperwash. So after the war was over, they expected to get this reserve back, and they never got it back. So in 1996, the Stony Point Indians, the ones that were still from this reserve, they occupied it. This became Ipperwash National Park. And so after the summer season was over, they occupied it, peaceful. There was no guns, no nothing, they just occupied it. And the government wouldn't give them back this land, even though that's what they had agreed to in the first place. They wouldn't give it back to them. So they were there for about a week, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, the Ontario Police Force showed up in full riding gear. Batons and the helmets and the shields, everything. And they went in there by force. One of the guys that was there came to the fence. There's a fence separating the two, and this was in moonlight, and he was carrying a stick. And one of the snipers decided that the stick was a rifle, and he shot him. And he didn't kill him, so he shot him again. And they took him to the hospital. He was bleeding, and he died. So they started an investigation. All of the police officers that took part in this raid all backed each other up except for one. The guy that shot the protester, fellow standing behind him, when he took the stand, he says no. He said he did not have a rifle in his hand. He had a piece of stick in his hand. So the judge went to that point, and they X'd out where they were standing, where the protester was on the other side of the fence, and you could clearly say, if somebody was carrying a stick or a weapon, they would know. And so he convicted that police officer of manslaughter, 2 years less than date. So the family said, well, that's great, that's justice, sort of for our family member. But now we want to find out who gave this order. You know, that policemen, they have an order in their ranks, right? So somebody had to give them the order to be in full riot gear and to go there. So they started an inquiry. In 2006, 6 years ago, the premier at the time that order was given, the premier at that time was Mike Harris. And they released a transcript. They released a transcript, and they also released his phone, the phone call that he had made. And he said, get those effing Indians out of there. So that's how far after that inquiry was on. It went all the way back to the premier. He gave the order for them to, you know, he didn't command them to kill anybody, but it just happened that way. So when we say the reserves do not belong to the native people, this is proof of it. We also know that because we've asked on the United States side, some of our Dakota communities, if you don't believe us, then go ask for the title to the land. A lot of you have land here, you have title to the land. Well, we don't. It's held in trust by the federal government. So a lot of what we do, it's done out of necessity, not because we're trying to be militant or anything of that nature. What our elders, what my uncle has been fighting for all these years is, all we want to do is look after ourselves. You know, we don't want to be spoon-fed. We don't want anybody looking after us. You know, that community that we come from, Sioux Valley, was one of the most prosperous communities in Canada. Not reserves, but a prosperous community. Back in the day, we used to have steam threshing machines. We had 3 of them, and we bought these with our own money. You know, even though it was called a reserve, we still had our own money. We didn't believe in the Indian Act. We didn't want any help from the government. So we used to have gardens, and we used to plant crops, and we used to do everything. And our men used to go work in a neighboring with the farmers. And they also say that they used to take these threshing machines and they used to go and help the neighboring farmers. So what's wrong with that? Instead, they bring in the Indian agent. I don't know if a lot of you guys are familiar with the Bible or not, but they say that when the Antichrist shows up, you can't buy anything, you can't sell anything, you can't do anything unless you have this mark of the beast, right? Well, during the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, when the Indian agent was sent to the reserve, my uncle, our elders, my grandfathers, they could not leave the reserve. They could not buy anything. They could not sell anything unless they had a piece of paper from the Indian agent that they could leave the reserve. But he controlled everything. He controlled the money. So some of our veterans after the Second World War, everybody in Canada, all the veterans were given a parcel of land and they were given money so that they could start a farm. Well, what happened on our reserve, in the reserves of Canada, was that they gave them 160 acres, but they gave it to them on the reserve. And the money that they received, the Indian agent took it. He went and bought all this equipment, and according to my uncle and the elders, this was all equipment that wasn't big enough or didn't have the capacity to do what it was supposed to do. So the government, through the years, they've killed every economic development opportunity that we had, and then they brought welfare into the picture, and that basically killed us. And so we don't want to live on handouts, right? So we made an agreement with the Mohawks, 6 Nations. 6 Nations are also of the same belief that we are. They've never signed a treaty with the government either. And their reserves straddle both sides of the border. And I don't know if you guys remember 1996, 1992, there was what they call that Oka incident in Montreal, Quebec. Well, you go over this Mercier Bridge, they call it, right? And you don't know where Montreal ends and you don't know where the Kanawaki Reserve begins. But you go there now and you can tell where it is because there's a street there. And Kanawaki is basically a suburb of Montreal. But what the Mohawks did was they exercised their sovereignty and they started making their own tobacco, selling their own cigarettes. And so when you go there now, you know where this border is between the two, because on one side you've got smoke shops all along the highway, on the other side you don't. And so that, of course, with these tobacco products, these cigarettes, are licensed by Canada, right? They're licensed by Canada, but the province doesn't have their tape on it. And this is a package of those cigarettes. So there's a stamp. There's a Canadian stamp. It's just like a postage stamp that goes on here. You have to break in order to open it, right? And then the cellophane wrapping that goes around here. There's a tearaway tape on here. Well, that's where the province has their duty paid stamp on it, right? So we took Canada to court in 2009, right? And nothing happened. Canada didn't want to help us with anything. So what we did was we made an agreement with the Mohawks. We're going to sell their cigarettes. We bought a piece of property off the reserve, this fee simple property off the reserve, and we started selling cigarettes. But prior to doing that, this was November of last year when we started it. So we wrote letters to the municipality, to the province, which is like a state down here, and then we wrote letters to Canada and we informed them what we were doing. We're not asking them for permission, we're informing them that this is what they're going to do. So of course we get the standard letters back saying, you're Indians, you can't do anything. And so we opened up November 9th of last year, and we notified all the press and everybody, and through the previous years, there's other reserves, other Indians, like the treaty Indians, that have tried to do this. And as soon as they do that, the first time they try and open up, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police come in and they shut them down. They raid them and they shut them down. And you never hear about it again. So we had the press there. We had satellite trucks and everybody came into came to the store that afternoon, and nothing happened. So we opened up again the next day, and the next day, and the next day after that, and finally a week later we got raided. And so the press had they were having a field day with this. This is great. We were making national headlines right across Canada. And so what happened previous with the other Indians in the area, or the different provinces, when they get raided, they shut down. You never hear about them again. They asked us, well, what are you guys going to do? Well, it's business as usual. Well, what does that mean? Well, we're going to open up again tomorrow. And yeah, I was talking on the phone. I could tell I went on the speakerphone because all of a sudden I could hear background noise. And they said, well, you guys got raided. What are you going to open up with? Well, I said, come on, we knew we were going to get raided. You think we're going to keep all our inventory in one place? I think they kind of chuckled. I said, yeah, I guess. So you have your product different places, and we said, well, we're not going to comment on it, just that we have product. And so we'll be back again tomorrow. So the press showed up en masse again, the satellite trucks and everything, and waited for the cavalry to arrive, and nobody showed up again. So it wasn't until 2 or 3 weeks later that we got raided again. Same thing. They took what we had on the shelves, took what money we had, and this went on for, we got raided 5 times between then and May. And then the province, what the initial plan was not just for economic development, but it was also to bait the province into charging us, because Canada wasn't finishing out the court battle with us, so we took the province, and so the province charged us, and we ended up in court with them. So there's a little bit of a story here, but when we had our initial lawyer with court case with Canada. And then when we got into this court challenge with the province, we hired a different lawyer. And these lawyers, we explained to them that, you know, we're doing this as a sovereign nation. You know, we've never signed treaties with Canada. We still have our land base, we still have our people, we still have our language. We don't need you to think for us, we just need you to guide us through this process, right? So we hired these lawyers and they say, yeah, we can do this. And then the first meeting they have with Canada or the province or the Crown, they come back to us and they say, your rights are protected by the Canadian Constitution, Section 35, you have Aboriginal rights. No, we don't. You know, I've already shown you documents where Canada says we don't have any Aboriginal rights. So, this other lawyer, and he actually banged his fist on the table, he said, I'm the man, I'm the guy that'll help you guys. So he says, I understand you guys are sovereign and everything. So he goes to a meeting with Canada, and then he comes back again. And he says, your rights are protected as Aboriginals, you know, the same old thing. So we fired him. Now my uncle, he's been doing this for a number of years. So back in 1987, they hired this international lawyer, right? And he's part of a bigger law firm. And he says that he can help us. So we fly him in, we show him this presentation, like all this evidence that we have, right? And he says, yeah, I understand, I know what you're doing. We made a submission to the United Nations back in 1987 on behalf of various native tribes. And so he goes back and my uncle says, I told my uncle that we had gotten this. Now my uncle is 85 years old and he does seasonal work with one of the neighboring companies. And, you know, he has to, you know, the pension that he gets isn't enough for him and his family, so he still works. And he was working at the time anyway, so I told him about this and he was happy. You know, we got an international lawyer, he's gonna help us. I said, I have a copy of his submission to the United Nations. I said, that's great. He says, I'll get you a copy. So he gives me a copy and I'm on the road quite a bit, so driving down the road one day, pull out this report and it's got a nice cover letter, you know, with lawyer, and then I open it and there's the submission to the United Nations. First sentence, we as Indian people. I thought you said you know, well, I phoned him and I said, I thought you understood that we don't like being called Indians. Well, there's a story behind that which I'll get to in a little bit, but he says, who are you to question me? I'm 85 years old. I've been doing this for 45 years. I've represented the Crees of Northern Alberta, Northern Saskatchewan, the Hopis, Navajos, and he names a whole slew of Native people. So I let him finish. And I said, in all those 45 years, I said, what has it gotten any of it? And then he starts questioning my intelligence, my education. Do you have a master's degree in history? I said, no. Do you have a master's degree in English? No. Well, what you're reading is not right, he says. And he goes on and he says, I have colleagues with master's degrees in history and English. And he says, when I need something, he says, I go to my colleagues and I ask them for that. I need something interpreted, send it to the guy with the master's degree in English. And they write the report, give it to me. And so I can get a little sarcastic sometimes. So I said to him, I like to think I have a good command of the English language. And I can read, I finished high school, did a little bit of university, a little bit of college, I don't have any degrees. And I said, I can read a sentence, I can read a paragraph. I said, I can even read a whole page, and I can tell you exactly what that means, what it says. If you have to go to somebody with a master's degree in English to interpret that word for you, I said, that's your problem. And then he says to me, he gets mad and he says to me, he says, you Dakotas, you get off your high horse, you're just Indians. And so we had no more lawyer again. And so we're in a court case with Canada, right? In the province of Manitoba. And when we talk about this, people say, well, who's your lawyer? Well, we don't have a lawyer. What do you mean you don't have a lawyer? to have a lawyer. Who's thinking for you? We are. And then the conversation will go on, and then a little while later, well, who's your lawyer? We don't have one. You know, this will go on, and people can't believe that we don't have a lawyer. And we don't need a lawyer, we just needed somebody to help us through that case, right? So after we fired our lawyers, interesting thing happened. When, I don't know if anybody of you are involved in any court cases, right? But your lawyer goes up against their lawyer, right? Do you ever get to see any of the actual documentation yourself? Okay, we've asked for it, but we've never actually seen what actually happens between the two, right? But we know there's back court deals going on and stuff. So this is what happened. The fellow's name is Orville Smoke. And again, he's our leader, but to the government of Canada, he's the chief, right? But he's not elected, he's our traditional form of government, right? So he gets this package in the mail, it's about that thick. You know, and there's 3 binders in there. And in there they have all the evidence that they have against us in this provincial court battle, right? We find out that we're under surveillance. So if somebody's listening, hi, I'm in Woodstock, New York. We were under surveillance. You know, some of you that know Facebook, they had copies of what we were talking about on Facebook. And the beauty of what we're doing is, they can put us under surveillance all they want. We're not hiding anything. We're open. It's all open. And so these documents that we got, the provincial government, the Crown, is so arrogant that they even have the possible defenses that we could use and how they're going to beat them. So according to them, their documents, we called it an intimidation package. They're trying to intimidate us into thinking that they're going to win. So I stay up till about 2 o'clock in the morning going through the stuff, and I'll show you this. There's a couple of things here. Now, we don't like the word Indian. The word Indian, some of the native people, they say it comes from the Latin word indios, meaning godlike, right? But the word Indian comes from Christopher Columbus. He was trying to find a shortcut to India, right? So Galileo at that time, and you guys must remember, you know, school yet. I remember reading about that they thought the world was flat. And then they had these, you know, water falling off and these dragons on the bottom, or fire or something like that. So Galileo in the late 1400s, he's considered the father of astronomy. He invented a telescope. And he tells the Church of the Roman Catholic Church that it's not the sun that revolves around the earth. It's the earth that revolves around the sun. And we're not the center of the universe. And back then, there was no separation between church and state. So if you go against the church, then you get charged with heresy. So the father of astronomy, Galileo, was thrown in prison for 10 years. He spent the last 10 years of his life under house arrest. So he published his documents, and this is where the explorers got this idea that if the world is round, then we sail west and we can come up on the other side, right? Because we've talked to some people from the Middle East, and we asked them, why is the Middle East so important? You know? But that's the trade route between the 3 continents, right? Europe, Asia, and Africa. So whoever had control of that territory basically controlled the economy. So at that time, there was a war going on, and so Christopher Columbus went to different countries, to England and France and Germany, and finally he convinced the King and Queen of Spain to finance his trip. What they did was they miscalculated the circumference of the earth. They thought it was this round, and really it was this round. So what they thought was what they had gone all the way around to the eastern end of the continent, and actually they landed in San Salvador. But because they were, you know, Indians, they were native, right? He took 10 of them, the Taino people, 10 of them, and he took them back to Spain, convinced the king and queen that he was on the eastern shore of the continent and that India was just further in. So after they figured out that, well, they got to the western shores of the Americas, and there's another ocean over there, and that's the Pacific Ocean, right? So now they know that this isn't the same continent. So now they have a dilemma on their hands, because when he made the agreement with the King and Queen of Spain, again, there's no separation between church and state, right? Any lands that he discovers is on behalf of Spain. Any people that he meets, he has to convert them to Christianity. And how do you convert somebody to Christianity? Well, you baptize them. So now he's got a dilemma on his hands, him and all the other Spanish explorers. If you baptize somebody, they become a human being. And once they become a human being, you can't enslave them, you can't take their personal possessions, you can't take their land, you can't do these, the things that they were doing to them at the time. And so this is where that word Indian comes from, right? So when we received all this information from the government, right? So it says here, application of provincial laws to Indians. Now, we don't call ourselves Indians, we don't call ourselves Aboriginal, we don't call ourselves First Nations, we're not Indigenous, we're Dakota people. Okay, so it is well settled that provincial laws of general application apply to Indians and lands reserved for Indians, right? So now, the province, I said they're very arrogant, right? Here's their sovereignty argument. The defendants assert that they are not bound by provincial law because they do not relinquish their sovereignty through treaty. In essence, they argue that the Dakota people of a sovereign nation are not subject to the rule of law in Canada. With respect, no court has countenanced such an argument. So the court has never decided on this, and yet they're saying that we're not who we say we are. Okay, so they've already gone to court with the treaty Indians, I said before, right? So here, it says here, this is from the Sparrow case in 1990. This is the Supreme Court ruling, okay? There was from the outset never any doubt that sovereignty and legislative power, and indeed the underlying title to such lands, vested in the Crown. So from the outset, meaning as soon as they set foot on our shores, they had sovereignty to all of this continent. They had legislative power, and indeed the underlying title to such lands. Now, they make statements in here that criminal law applied to Aboriginal people regardless of tribal laws. Royal Proclamation was supposed to be 1763. Sovereign nation recognized by the Royal Proclamation because of ancestral rights. The principle of sovereign integrity dictates that a state has exclusive sovereignty over all persons, citizens, or aliens, over all property, real or personal, within its territory. Thus, Aboriginal people are subject to criminal and provincial laws. Now, this principle of sovereign integrity, what does that mean? So, you look at this. Where does the rules of sovereignty come from? Well, in Europe, there used to be a family called the Habsburgs. They were in and around the German and Austria area. And so the Habsburgs controlled most of the territory. So this is where you get your kings and your knights and your royal lineage blood. And so they would go out into the land and they would collect taxes from the people, meaning they would take half of their chickens and half of their livestock and whatever. And so there was a war that happened in 1618. It was called the 30-Year War, so it ended in 1648. And from there was a series of peace treaties called the Westphalia Peace Treaty, the Peace of Westphalia. So from these treaties is where they get the laws of sovereignty. And these are the rules that they used when they came to North America. So according to those laws, the only way you can be sovereign if say our group went on a cruise ship down into South America or into the South Pacific somewhere, if we found an island, we could claim sovereignty according to these rules if there were no people there, right? So where does that put us? Here. Well, this is what this Aboriginal, Indian, Indigenous. It's a lower form of human being. And so when we talk about this, it says Aboriginal rights are title. You know, we have the right to do this, but according to Aboriginal, the laws that they have, if we go into court as an Aboriginal the way the lawyers want us to, well, we're guaranteed to lose, right? So, um, 2 years ago, I took my mother down to the Grand Canyon. And on the way back, we were going to stop in Denver. Denver has a very good museum, and they have some Dakota artifacts there. And so we walk in, and there's a planetarium, there's a movie theater, there's a NASA space station, you know, and it's all very nice. And so I asked the lady at the front, I said, where's the Native American exhibit? She says, it's on the second floor. So we go take the escalator to the second floor, right? I'm with my mom. My mom's 71 years old. My aunt, my daughter, her boyfriend, and my niece. Going up the escalator, and they say, well, you get to the top of the escalator, you turn right, and it's right there at the end of the hall. So we get to the top of the escalator, and we turn right, and what do we see? This. And I couldn't believe it, you know. We talk about this, right? But you know, here's an example of it. So, you look on the, there's a legend there, right? And you look at it, and it says North American Indian cultures, and then it says North American wildlife. And so we go through the doors, and there's a glass case there. It's about this thick. And there's a native man and a native woman. They're all dressed nicely in leather. In the background, there's pictures of buffalo and everything else. There's 2 kids sitting there, and then beside them, there's a bear family: Papa bear, Mama bear, baby bear, sister bear. And beside them, there's a stuffed moose. And then,
Is that why it's named North Dakota, for the Dakota people?
yeah. It used to be the Great Sioux Territory, Great Sioux Reservation. So that previous map that I showed you, what we wanted to do was to superimpose the reserves, the existing Dakota reserves, over that map, just to show that we're still within that territory, that the last map, we have that 1857 map. So anyway, this is Minnesota. There's all the little reserves here. This is South Dakota, Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, Pine Ridge, Rosebud. This is where the Battle of Little Bighorn took place here. There's Fort Peck, Spirit Lake. So these are the, and then this was a map on a wall. You know, when we were doing some business down in the States. So I asked if I could take a picture of it. I said, sure, go ahead. So then I'm looking, and there's other color-coded areas in here. So I'm wondering what's this about? So it says Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, Department of Defense. These are weapons testing ranges, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, National Park Service, Tennessee Valley Authority, other agencies. We're still listed with the fish and the wildlife and the trees and flora and fauna. say that an Indian is a lower form of life, it's not really a human being. I'm not saying that to be, you know, to be ignorant or anything like that. That's the way we've been treated all our whole existence since the Europeans arrived. And again, there's a word, remember, it's washichu, it's a greedy person. You know, we shouldn't have homeless people in our land here. We shouldn't have hungry people. But the greed of the corporate entities and the government and its people, this is why our land is the way it is. And it shouldn't be like that. So, with our court case, we submitted, you know, the evidence that we've accumulated, right? The province of Manitoba sent us an email in September, and they said, they acknowledge our map that we had up there before. They say, you were always here. They conceded that. You were always here. You've never signed any treaty with Canada. You've never surrendered your rights or your title. Now we want to discuss sovereignty. Well, how would you discuss sovereignty when you've already admitted to all of these three things? Well, again, in their arrogance, right? They're trying to paint us with the same brush as everybody else. They're trying to they're trying to pull us back into Indian world, into Aboriginal world, First Nation world, or Indigenous world. And so they say, well, how are you sovereign? Well, we still have our people, we still have our language, we still have our laws. We've never surrendered. That's how we're sovereign. So now we turned around and we said, how are you sovereign? So they say in their court document, it said, at the very outset, there was never any doubt that sovereignty, legislative power, and the title to land is vested in the Crown. Well, in the documents that we acquired, there's a fellow, an interesting fellow by the name of William Coltman. Now Coltman, he sent a confidential letter to a fellow by the name of Governor Sherbrooke. And so Coltman was a judge. And what happened at that time was, well, I'll have to find this map. In this part of the territory here, where it says Fort Garry, there was what they called the Red River Settlement at the time. And the Hudson's Bay Company, the Hudson's Bay Charter, they had control of all waters that flowed into. So the Red River flows north from South Dakota, Minnesota, North Dakota, and it flows north into Manitoba, into Canada. So the Hudson's Bay Company fur traders were still in this area, and then at the same time, the United States made the Northwest Company, and so they sent their fur traders were all in this area, and what happened was they started killing each other. So they sent this judge, Colville, to the Red River Settlement, and he was going to try this case. And then once he got there, he started questioning whether or not he had the valid right to sit there as a judge, like this was called Indian Territory at the time, whether or not he had the right to sit there as a judge. So he sends this letter back to Ottawa. And we have a copy of this letter, like there's actual transcript from his letter. I mean, his handwritten letter.